Welcome to European Journeys. This is the fifth stage of a tour that takes us to Latvia and Estonia, and where we explore the Reformation of Livonia that happened in the 16th century. For the first four stages of this tour, we were exploring locations in Latvia, but for this stage we are going to cross the northern border of Latvia and enter into Estonia. And the place we are going to visit is none other than the capital of Estonia, which is obviously Tallinn. Now, if you visit Tallinn, you will quickly notice that this is a very ancient medieval town. There are still the ancient walls standing in many parts of the city, and many ancient buildings are there as well. And in fact, this is a very old town, and it had several names in the past. It was called Lindanisse by the Danes, and it was called Reval by the Germans. And this obviously shows that the history of this city is linked with an extensive foreign domination here. The Danes were here, the Germans were here as well, the Swedes also were here for a while, and most recently the Russians have occupied the land. But the city of Tallinn, in fact, in medieval times, was also a very important trading center. It was part of the Hanseatic League, and it was a city that was well located along the Gulf of Finland on the southern shores, and it was along a route, a merchant route that is, between Russia and Spain. And in fact, if you come today by ferry from Finland, for example, to Estonia, the very first building you might see as you are on the ferry, the first building you might see in Tallinn is the spire of a church. And this spire is nearly 125 meters tall. Now this is rather high indeed. Usually spires, there are big spires in Western Europe, and usually these spires were built in medieval times to be a sign of the majesty of God. But here in Tallinn, there was also an economic purpose, because the spire served also as a marker, as a sign for the sailors who were crossing the Gulf of Finland, and as they would see the sign, they would come ashore. They would come to the harbor of Tallinn, which was obviously important for the economics, for the economy of Tallinn, obviously. So the spire of the church is, in fact, the church that we are going to focus upon today, and this is called Oleviste Kirik in Estonian, that is Saint Olaf's Church in English. It is a church that is located within the old town, not so far from the current harbor of Tallinn, and the first thing you might notice that is rather surprising about this church is that it is not a Lutheran church, even though the Lutheran Church of Estonia is the dominant church of the country. And it is not a Roman Catholic church either. In fact, it is a Baptist church, and that's quite surprising because Baptists usually don't have such big cathedrals as a place of worship. But this is the case here in Tallinn, and this is in fact linked to a very recent history. In the 1950s, when the Soviet Union was occupying the land, they decided that Oleviste Church should become a Baptist church. Now, obviously, they were not so much concerned about Christianity. In fact, they wanted to eradicate Christianity. So it might sound surprising that they would decide, in fact, that the church should be assigned to a specific denomination. But the purpose was clear. It was a scheme that they thought, if we allow only one denomination to exist in a city, then Christians will fight against each other and they will self-destroy their own church. And sadly, this is what happened in many parts of the Soviet Union, but here in Tallinn it caused quite the opposite effect of what they really wanted to see happening. In fact, the Christians got united together. It was not easy, but they did so. And in the 1970s, God even showed up in a rather remarkable way. A big revival happened there in Oleviste Church in Tallinn, and it's a revival that would last for several years there. And it's rather a known revival in the West, but there was a big revival there right under the Soviet authorities, under the eyes of the Soviet rulers here in Tallinn, where we would need another stage to talk about this revival, because the reason we are coming here today is to explore the Reformation of Livonia that happened in the 16th century. And Oraviste Church was a very important place for the Reformation in Tallinn. In fact, in 1524, here came one of the first reformers on Estonian ground. His name was Zacharias Hasse, and he began to preach the gospel here from the pulpit of Oraviste Church. Well, it was quite a bold decision on his part because, in fact, it caused a lot of tension in the city, just as it did in Riga or elsewhere in Europe. It did also here in Tallinn. And this is also because the church, Oraviste Church, belonged to a monastery that was not so far from Oraviste Church, St. Michael's Cistercian Monastery. Today, the building belongs to an Orthodox church. It is called the Cathedral of the Transfiguration of our Lord, and so just a few hundred meters from Oraviste Church. But these monks were not happy at all with this reformer coming to preach the Lutheran doctrines, which they thought to be heretical, obviously. So tension began to rise in the city. Now, he was not the only reformer coming in the city. Around the same time, another reformer came and preached the gospel in another church of the city, that was St. Nicholas Church, without any permission. So as you can imagine, the situation in the city was quite tense. Well, the city council here in Tallinn, just as it was the case in Riga, began to favor the Reformation, and they took the bold step, shortly after Riga, to appoint officially a Reformed preacher in Oraviste Church, even though the Roman Catholic hierarchy was against it. And so they took exactly the same decision as in Riga. They were emboldened, probably encouraged by what had happened in Riga. And so they did the same here in Tallinn, appointing Zacharias Hasse in Oraviste Church. Well, the tension did not calm down, obviously, and the Roman Catholic in the city obviously reacted against that. And so the city council decided to take the same steps as did the city of Riga. That is, to organize a public disputation. So they offered a public disputation to be organized in the city between the reformers on one side and the Roman Catholics on the other, that would be represented by the Dominicans in the city. There were several monasteries in the city, the Cistercians I talked about, but also the Dominicans, where the Dominicans refused. And why did they refuse? Most probably because they heard of what happened in Riga. The public disputation did not turn in their advantage at all. They had been roundly defeated by the reformers in Riga. So they did not want that to happen there in Tallinn, most probably. And that's most probably one of the reasons why they refused to tackle the question of the Reformation around the debate. And the situation did not subside very quickly, and in fact, the city council also caused probably the situation to rise a little bit, the tension to rise a little bit, because they at some point asked the Dominicans of the city to assign their material goods, to give the material goods to the city council. That obviously the Dominicans did not want to, and so they sent a request to the main ruler of Livonia, the secular ruler, the Grand Master of the Livonian order, Walter von Plettenberg, to defend them. Walter von Plettenberg was still on the side of the Roman Catholics at the time, and so he sent a letter of admonishment to the city council in order to stop them from seizing the belongings of the Roman Catholics, the Roman Catholic monasteries in the city. Where the tension continued to arise, the crowds more and more followed the reformers, who were obviously listening carefully their preaching and began to discover the truth of the gospel, and also began to discover the lies that were perpetrated, that were within the Roman Catholic Church, which had been the main church in Tallinn for the past 300 years. And so on the 15th of September, 1524, the 14th of September, 1524, crowds of people entered several churches in the city, including Oraviste Church, to remove what they deemed idolatrous. That were the statues, there were all sorts of objects that were there, And so they entered there to remove them, they destroyed some of them, and many people stole also those things, some of those objects or materials. Well, that the city council was not happy about that, obviously. Knowing the tense situation, this would probably not lead to a positive outcome. So on the next day, they ordered that the stolen goods would be restituted to the Roman Catholics in the city. Well, the tension remained for quite a while there in Tallinn, but Oraviste Church never went back to the Roman Catholic Church. It would stay in the hands of the reformers, and it would become a Lutheran church with time. And less than 10 years later, Tallinn adopted officially the Reformation, and that is quite a thing, really. Less than 10 years after the first reformers came there to preach the gospel, it took less than 10 years to have the vast majority of the city really turning towards the Reformation. So nothing short of a miracle. And then less than 4 decades later, the last Roman Catholic building in the city was finally handed over to the Lutheran Church. So Zacharias Hasse, Johann Lange, the first two preachers of the Reformation, preachers of the gospel here in Tallinn in the 16th century, might have probably not foreseen what would happen, how the preaching of the gospel would really transform the city, and in such a rapid way indeed. Nothing short of a miracle, as I said. And this would in fact have a big influence not only in Tallinn, but outside in other parts of Estonia, in smaller towns as well. I'm Cedric Placentino. See you next week for another stage of European Journeys.